The pistol pressed against Grace Vaughn's spine, felt colder than the metal should have been in the Arizona heat, and she understood in that crystalline moment of terror that her father-in-law had finally found a way to rid himself of the burden she had become. 3 months had passed since the fever took her husband Daniel, and in those 3 months, old Jeremiah Blackwell had made it abundantly clear that a 22-year-old widow with no children was nothing more than another mouth to feed on his struggling ranch outside Old Tucson. She had worked herself to exhaustion trying to prove her worth, mending fences under the brutal sun, tending the vegetable garden, cooking and cleaning until her hands bled, but it was never enough. Jeremiah's eyes had grown colder with each passing week, and this morning when the trader's wagon had rolled up the dusty path, she had seen something shift in the old man's expression that made her blood run cold. "Get in the wagon, girl," Jeremiah growled, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond a grim satisfaction. The trader, a squat man with greasy hair and tobacco-stained teeth, grinned at her with undisguised hunger. His name was Silas Kern, and he dealt in goods both legal and otherwise across the Arizona territory. Grace had heard whispers about men like him, men who trafficked in human misery, selling women to mining camps and brothels scattered across the lawless stretches of the frontier. "Please," Grace whispered, her green eyes filling with tears as she looked at the man who had once welcomed her into his family. "Jeremiah, Daniel would not have wanted this. I have nowhere else to go." "Should have thought about that before you failed to give my son an heir," Jeremiah spat. "You are worthless to me. Silas here offered me $50 for you. That is $50 more than you are worth eating my food and taking up space." The injustice of it burned through Grace's chest like a branding iron. She had loved Daniel with everything in her heart, had mourned him with a grief that still woke her gasping in the night. They had only been married 8 months before the fever took him. 8 months was barely enough time to establish a household, let alone conceive a child. But Jeremiah had decided she was to blame for remaining childless, as if she had chosen for her husband to die and leave her alone in this harsh, unforgiving land. Silas grabbed her arm with fingers that dug into her flesh like talons. "Come on, pretty thing. We have got a long ride ahead of us. I have got a buyer waiting in Tombstone who pays top dollar for clean girls like you." His breath reeked of whiskey and rot as he yanked her toward the wagon. Grace stumbled, her worn boots catching in the hem of her faded calico dress. She had no belongings to take with her, nothing but the clothes on her back and the thin gold wedding band on her finger. As Silas shoved her into the back of the covered wagon, she caught one last glimpse of the ranch house where she had briefly known happiness. The whitewashed walls seemed to mock her now, a prison she was being expelled from only to face something far worse. The wagon lurched forward, and Grace fell against rough wooden crates that smelled of old tobacco and something darker she did not want to identify. Silas had tied her wrists together with coarse rope that bit into her skin. She could hear him whistling tunelessly as he drove the horses hard down the rutted trail that led away from the ranch, away from Old Tucson, away from everything she had known. What Grace did not know was that Quinton Barrett had been riding up to the Blackwell ranch at the exact moment Jeremiah was shoving her into Silas Kern's wagon. Quinton was a cowboy who worked at the neighboring Double R Ranch, and he had been coming to check on Grace, as he had done several times since Daniel's death. At 26 years old, Quinton had the kind of rugged handsomeness that came from a life lived outdoors. All sun, bronzed skin, and lean muscle, earned through hard work. His dark hair fell to his collar, and his blue eyes held a depth of feeling he usually kept carefully hidden beneath a calm, steady demeanor. Quinton had known Grace since she had first arrived in Old Tucson as Daniel's new bride, and he had been struck immediately by her spirit and kindness. She had a way of finding beauty in the harsh desert landscape, pointing out the delicate wildflowers that bloomed after rare rains or the way the sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson. He had told himself his interest was merely neighborly concern, but he knew in his heart it was far more than that. He had kept his distance while she was married, respecting the sanctity of her vows, but after Daniel's death, he had found excuses to ride by to check on her welfare, to make sure Jeremiah was treating her with the respect she deserved. Now, as he crested the rise that overlooked the Blackwell Ranch, Quinton saw the wagon disappearing in a cloud of dust down the southern trail. Something about the scene made his gut clench with foreboding. He urged his horse, a reliable bay gelding named Copper, down the slope toward the ranch house where Jeremiah stood watching the wagon's departure with his arms crossed over his chest. "Jeremiah," Quinton called out as he reined Copper to a halt. "Where is Grace? Was that her in that wagon?" The old man's face twisted into a sneer. "None of your concern, Barrett. The girl is gone and good riddance. I made a business transaction, perfectly legal." Quinton's blood turned to ice. "What kind of business transaction?" His voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that made wise men step back. "Sold her to Silas Kern. He is taking her to Tombstone. She will fetch a good price there, I imagine." Jeremiah's casual tone, as if he were discussing the sale of a horse rather than a human being, made Quinton's hands ball into fists. "You sold her." Quinton could barely process the words. "You sold Daniel's widow like she was livestock. She is my property to do with as I please. She lived under my roof, ate my food. I had every right." Jeremiah's eyes were hard and defiant. Quinton did not waste time arguing the morality or legality of what Jeremiah had done. Every second he stood there was another second that wagon was putting distance between himself and Grace. He wheeled Copper around and drove his heels into the horse's flanks, sending the gelding leaping forward into a gallop. The sun was already past its zenith, beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. Quinton calculated rapidly as he rode. The wagon would be slower than a single rider, especially on these rough trails. Silas would be heading south toward Tombstone, probably planning to make camp somewhere along the San Pedro River before tackling the final stretch tomorrow. If Quinton pushed hard, he could catch them before nightfall. He had to. The thought of Grace in Silas Kern's custody made Quinton's chest tight with a fear and fury he had never experienced before. He knew the stories about Silas, knew the man was little better than a slaver who preyed on the desperate and powerless. The idea of Grace, with her gentle spirit and kind heart, being sold to some brutal mining camp or forced into a brothel was unbearable. Copper was a strong horse, well-rested and well-fed, and Quinton pushed him hard but not cruelly, knowing he needed the gelding's endurance for what might be a long chase. The landscape rolled past in shades of tan and rust, dotted with saguaro cacti and scrubby mesquite. The air shimmered with heat, and sweat soaked through Quinton's shirt as he rode, but he did not slow in the wagon. Grace had managed to work herself into a sitting position despite her bound wrists. Through a gap in the canvas cover, she could see the trail unwinding behind them. Her mind raced, trying to formulate some kind of plan, but every scenario ended badly. She could try to throw herself from the wagon, but with her hands tied, she would likely break her neck. She could wait until they stopped and try to run, but Silas was armed and she was not. She could scream for help, but they were miles from any settlement, and the only people likely to hear her screams were exactly the kind of men who would not care. "You behaving back there, sweetheart," Silas called over his shoulder. Do not get any ideas about causing trouble. I will hogtie you proper if I have to, and that would be a shame. Buyers pay more for undamaged goods. Grace bit back the retort that rose to her lips. Antagonizing him would gain her nothing. Instead, she focused on her surroundings, trying to remember everything Daniel had taught her about navigation in the territory. They were heading roughly south, probably toward the San Pedro River crossing. The sun was beginning to sink lower, painting long shadows across the desert floor. In a few hours, it would be dark. Quinton saw the dust cloud from the wagon when he was still a mile back. Relief and determination surged through him in equal measure. He was gaining on them, closing the distance. The trail here wound through a series of low hills covered in sparse vegetation, offering some cover if he needed it. He slowed Copper to a canter, not wanting to announce his approach too obviously. As he drew closer, Quinton could make out the details of the wagon, the two horses pulling it, and Silas Kern's hulking form on the driver's seat. He needed a plan. Simply riding up and demanding Grace's release would likely result in violence. And while Quinton was no stranger to a fight, he did not want to risk Grace getting hurt in any confrontation. The trail ahead narrowed where it passed between two rocky outcroppings. Quinton knew this stretch well, had ridden it dozens of times. It was the perfect place for an ambush. He urged Copper forward, cutting cross-country to get ahead of the wagon, using the terrain to hide his approach. By the time Silas reached the narrows, Quinton was waiting, positioned behind a large boulder with a clear view of the trail. His rifle was in his hands, loaded and ready, though he hoped he would not have to use it. The sound of the wagon wheels grinding over rock and the jingle of harness grew louder. Quinton took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then stepped out into the middle of the trail just as the wagon rounded the bend. "Hold up there, Silas," Quinton called out, his rifle not quite aimed at the trader but very obviously present. Silas hauled back on the reins and the horses stamped and snorted, clearly tired from the hard pace he had been setting. The trader's eyes narrowed as he recognized Quinton. "Barrett. What in blazes are you doing out here? I could ask you the same question, but I already know the answer. You have got something that does not belong to you." Quinton's voice was level, but there was steel beneath the words. "If you are talking about the girl, she is mine, fair and square. Bought and paid for from her legal guardian. You have got no right to interfere. Grace is not property, and Jeremiah had no right to sell her. Let her go, Silas. You can keep whatever you paid him and call it a loss." From inside the wagon, Grace heard Quinton's voice and her heart leaped with a hope so fierce it was painful. "Quinton," she cried out, "I am back here." He tied my hands. Silas's hand moved toward the pistol on his hip, but Quinton's rifle came up in one smooth motion, the barrel now pointing directly at the trader's chest. "I would not do that if I were you. I am a good shot, Silas, and at this range I will not miss." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Silas's face was red with anger, but he was not stupid enough to draw on an armed man who had the drop on him. Slowly, he raised his hands away from his gun. "This is robbery, Barrett. You are going to hang for this. No, this is justice. Now climb down from that wagon nice and slow." Silas complied, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. Quinton kept the rifle trained on him as he moved around to the back of the wagon. When he pulled back the canvas and saw Grace sitting there, wrists bound and eyes wide with relief and residual fear, something in his chest cracked open. He had never allowed himself to fully acknowledge how much she meant to him, but seeing her like this, vulnerable and scared, made him realize he would have ridden through hell itself to reach her. "You are safe now," he said softly, pulling out his knife to cut the ropes binding her wrists. "I've got you." Grace's hands were numb from the tight bindings, and when the rope fell away, she gasped at the painful rush of blood returning to her fingers. Quinton helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle but sure on her waist. For a moment they stood there, close enough that she could see the concern and something deeper in his blue eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was lost. I thought no one would come." "I would always come for you," Quinton said, and the simple sincerity of the words held more weight than any flowery declaration could have. Silas spat in the dust. "This is not over, Barrett. I will have the law on you." Quinton turned to face him, his expression hardening. "You go ahead and do that, Silas. But you might want to consider whether you really want a judge looking into your business dealings. I imagine there are quite a few people who would be interested in testifying about the women you have trafficked across this territory. You want to take that chance." The trader's face went pale, then red again. He knew Quinton was right. If this went to court, too many ugly truths would come to light. "Give me back my $50 then," he demanded. "You will have to collect that from Jeremiah. I had nothing to do with your blood money." Quinton gestured with the rifle. "Now get back on that wagon and head back north. If I ever hear of you coming near Grace or Old Tucson again, you will answer to me. Are we clear?" Silas climbed back onto the wagon seat, his movements stiff with fury. He grabbed the reins and turned the horses with more force than necessary. As the wagon rumbled back up the trail, Quinton kept his rifle ready until it was out of sight. Only then did he let out a long breath and turn back to Grace. She was standing in the shade of one of the rock outcroppings, rubbing her chafed wrists. The afternoon sun caught her hair, turning it the color of honey, and Quinton was struck again by how beautiful she was, even worn and frightened as she was now. But it was not her physical beauty that drew him. It was the strength he saw in the set of her shoulders, the determination in her eyes even after everything she had been through. "What happens now?" Grace asked quietly. "I cannot go back to the ranch. Jeremiah made it very clear I am not welcome." "You are not going back there," Quinton said firmly. "I will take you into Old Tucson. There are good people there who will help you. Mrs. Henderson, who runs the boarding house, is always looking for help, and she is a decent woman. You can stay there until you figure out your next step." Grace nodded, but her expression was troubled. "I have no money, Quinton. I cannot pay for a room. I will take care of it." When she started to protest, he held up his hand. "Please, Grace, let me do this. You have been through enough today." Copper was ground tied nearby, and Quinton led the gelding over. "We need to get moving. I want to reach town before full dark." He swung up into the saddle and then reached down to help Grace up behind him. She hesitated for just a moment before taking his hand and letting him pull her up. She settled behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist to steady herself, and Quinton had to concentrate on keeping his breathing steady. The ride back to Old Tucson took just over 2 hours, and the sun had set by the time they reached the outskirts of town, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and deep blue. Grace had been quiet for most of the ride, her cheek resting against Quinton's back, and he had not pushed her to talk. He could only imagine the turmoil of emotions she must be feeling. Old Tucson was a modest settlement that had grown up around the mining and cattle trades, with a main street lined with wooden storefronts, a few saloons, a church, and the boarding house run by Martha Henderson, a widow in her 50s who had a reputation for both no-nonsense practicality and genuine kindness. Quinton rode directly to the boarding house and dismounted, then helped Grace down. The front door opened before they reached it, and Mrs. Henderson appeared, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp eyes taking in the scene immediately. "Quinton Barrett, what has happened?" "Grace, child, you look half dead on your feet." Quinton gave Mrs. Henderson a brief explanation of the day's events, and with each word the older woman's expression grew more thunderous. "Jeremiah Blackwell should be horsewhipped," she declared when Quinton finished. "Grace, you come inside right now. I've got a room for you, and do not even think about mentioning payment. You will earn your keep by helping around here, and I will not hear another word about it." Grace's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I do not know what I would have done. You would have survived, dear, because you are stronger than you know, but you do not have to just survive anymore. Come inside and I will get you some supper and a proper bed." Mrs. Henderson ushered Grace into the house with a gentle but firm hand, leaving Quinton standing on the porch. Before Grace disappeared inside, she turned back to look at him. "Quinton, I do not know how to thank you for what you did today. You saved my life." "You do not need to thank me, Grace. I just did what any decent person would do." "No," she said softly. "Most people would have looked the other way. You did not. That means everything to me." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Quinton felt that pull again, that magnetic attraction he had been fighting since the first day he met her. But she had been through hell today, and he would not add to her burden by declaring feelings she might not be ready to hear. "Get some rest," he said instead. "I will check on you tomorrow." Grace nodded and went inside, and Quinton stood there for a few more minutes, staring at the closed door. Then he mounted Copper and rode to the stable to tend to his horse before heading back to the Double R Ranch. His boss, Ralph Richardson, would need to know why he had been gone all day, and Quinton hoped the man would understand. As it turned out, Ralph not only understood but approved wholeheartedly. "Jeremiah Blackwell is a miserable excuse for a human being," the rancher declared over supper that night. "You did the right thing, Quinton. If you need time off to help Grace get settled, you take it." Over the following days and weeks, Quinton became a regular visitor to the boarding house. He would stop by in the evenings after finishing his work at the Double R, always with some excuse. He was just checking to make sure Silas had not come back. He was just seeing if Mrs. Henderson needed any repairs done. He was just dropping off some fresh vegetables from the ranch garden. But everyone, including Grace, knew the real reason for his visits. Grace was healing, both physically and emotionally. The chafe marks on her wrists faded, and the haunted look in her eyes gradually softened. She threw herself into work at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Henderson with cooking and cleaning and the endless tasks involved in running a place that housed a rotating cast of travelers, miners, and cowboys. She discovered she had a knack for making people feel welcome, and several of the regular boarders specifically requested her biscuits and stew. But it was Quinton's visits that she looked forward to most. At first, she told herself it was simple gratitude. He had saved her from a fate too horrible to contemplate, and of course she would be glad to see him. But as the days turned into weeks, Grace began to recognize that what she felt for Quinton Barrett went far deeper than gratitude. She loved the way he treated her as an equal, asking her opinions and actually listening to her answers. She loved his quiet strength and the gentleness in his hands when he helped Mrs. Henderson repair a broken chair or fix a loose board on the porch. She loved his laugh, rare but genuine, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She loved that he never pressured her, never pushed for more than she was ready to give, content to simply spend time in her company. What Grace did not know was that Quinton was struggling with his own feelings, torn between his growing love for her and his worry that she was still mourning Daniel, still healing from the trauma of being sold and nearly trafficked. He did not want to take advantage of her vulnerability, or seem like he had rescued her with expectations of something in return. One evening in late September, nearly a month after Quinton had intercepted Silas Kern's wagon, he and Grace were sitting on the front porch of the boarding house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Mrs. Henderson had discreetly found reasons to be inside, leaving them alone. "I received a letter today," Grace said quietly, "from Daniel's cousin in California. She heard about his death and wrote to offer her condolences." Quinton felt his heart sink, wondering if the cousin had offered Grace a place to stay, a way out of Old Tucson. That was kind of her. She invited me to come live with her family in Sacramento, said there were good opportunities there for a woman on her own. Grace was silent for a moment, then continued. "A month ago, I would have jumped at the chance, a fresh start somewhere far away from all the painful memories. And now," Quinton asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral even as his pulse hammered in his throat. Grace turned to look at him, and the expression in her green eyes made his breath catch. "Now I find I have reasons to stay. Good reasons." "Grace," Quinton started, but she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. "I know it has not been very long since Daniel died," she said. "And I know people might think it is too soon, but I also know that life is uncertain and precious, and I have learned not to waste chances when they come. Quinton, you saved my life, but more than that, you have given me a reason to want to live it again. I think I have been falling in love with you since the first time you rode up to check on me after Daniel passed." Quinton turned his hand over so he could lace his fingers through hers. "I have loved you since the day Daniel brought you home," he admitted. "I never said anything because you were his wife, and I would never have disrespected that. But after he died, I kept telling myself I needed to give you time, that you were grieving and vulnerable. I was so afraid of pushing you into something you were not ready for. I did love Daniel," Grace said honestly, "and I do still mourn him, but I also know he would not want me to spend the rest of my life alone and afraid. He would want me to be happy, and you make me happy, Quinton. You make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I never have before." Quinton lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I will court you properly," he said. "I will do this right. I want everyone to know I respect you and honor you." Grace smiled, a real smile that lit up her entire face. "I would like that very much." So began a courtship that was the talk of Old Tucson for weeks. Quinton was nothing if not determined to show everyone that Grace Vaughn was a woman of worth and virtue. He took her to church services on Sundays, sitting beside her in the pew with his hat in his hands and his attention focused on the reverend's sermon. He escorted her to the town's social dances, where they moved together across the floor with an ease that made other couples pause to watch. He brought her small gifts, thoughtful things like a book of poetry he had ordered from Tucson or wildflowers he had picked on the range. There was talk, of course. Some of the more judgmental townspeople thought Grace was moving on too quickly from her husband's death. But most people saw the genuine affection between Quinton and Grace and were happy for them. Mrs. Henderson became their staunchest defender, shutting down gossip with a sharp word and a sharper look whenever it started in her presence. Ralph Richardson gave Quinton a raise, along with a knowing smile and a comment that a man thinking about marriage probably needed a bit more income. Quinton took the hint and began making plans. He had some money saved, enough to start building a small house on the piece of land Ralph had offered to sell him at a good price. It was just 5 acres, but it was enough for a home and maybe a few cattle of their own someday. One crisp October evening, as the first hint of autumn coolness began to temper the Arizona heat, Quinton took Grace for a ride out to the land. They dismounted near a level spot with a clear view of the mountains, and Quinton spread out a blanket he had brought in his saddlebag. "This is where I would like to build our house," he said, the possessive hour slipping out naturally. "If you will have me, that is. Grace Vaughn, I know I should probably wait longer, should give you more time, but I cannot help how I feel. I love you with everything in me. I want to spend my life making you happy and keeping you safe. I want to build a home with you and maybe, if we are blessed, fill it with children. Will you marry me?" Grace looked at the man kneeling before her on that blanket, his blue eyes full of hope and love, and a vulnerability that made her heart ache in the best possible way. She thought about how far she had come from that terrible day when Jeremiah had sold her like cattle, how Quinton had ridden through the desert to save her, how patiently he had waited for her to heal. She thought about the future stretching out before them, full of possibility and promise. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Quinton Barrett, I will marry you. I will build a life with you and love you for all my days." Quinton surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground as he kissed her for the first time, a kiss full of pent-up longing and joy and promise. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into that moment. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Old Tucson. Grace wore a simple but beautiful dress of cream-colored muslin that Mrs. Henderson and several other women from town had helped her sew. Quinton wore his best suit, freshly cleaned and pressed, and stood at the altar with his heart in his eyes as Grace walked down the aisle toward him. Ralph Richardson stood up as Quinton's best man, and Mrs. Henderson sat in the front pew beaming like a proud mother. Half the town turned out for the ceremony, filling the pews and spilling out onto the church steps. Even some of the hands from the Double R Ranch had ridden in to witness their foreman's wedding. The Reverend kept the ceremony short but meaningful, speaking about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. When he pronounced them husband and wife, and told Quinton he could kiss his bride, the cowboy did not hesitate, pulling Grace close and claiming her lips in a kiss that had several of the older ladies fanning themselves. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by seemingly everyone in town. There was music and dancing and laughter, and Grace felt a happiness so complete it brought tears to her eyes. Just a few months ago, she had been sold and terrified, certain her life was over. Now she was married to a man she loved deeply, surrounded by a community that had welcomed her, with a future bright with promise. As the evening wore on and the stars came out, Quinton and Grace slipped away from the party. They rode together on Copper out to the land where their house was already beginning to take shape. Ralph had given Quinton time off to work on construction, and several of the ranch hands had pitched in to help. The frame was up and the roof was nearly complete. "It is not much yet," Quinton said as they stood looking at the skeletal structure in the moonlight, "but it will be home, our home." "It is perfect," Grace said, leaning against him. "Anywhere with you is perfect." They spent their wedding night under the stars, wrapped in blankets on that same spot where Quinton had proposed. It was not conventional or fancy, but it was theirs, and it was exactly what they both wanted. Quinton was gentle and patient, making sure Grace felt loved and cherished every moment. And Grace gave herself to him completely, without reservation or fear, knowing she was safe and treasured. The months that followed were filled with hard work, but also deep contentment. They finished the house by December, a snug 3-room structure with a bedroom, a main room that served as both kitchen and living space, and a small room that they both hoped would eventually be a nursery. Grace sewed curtains and braided rugs while Quinton built furniture. Mrs. Henderson donated some of her spare dishes and linens, and other townspeople contributed odds and ends until the little house felt like a real home. Quinton continued working at the Double R, but now he came home each evening to a warm house and a loving wife. Grace kept a garden and learned to preserve fruits and vegetables for the winter. She also took in some sewing work from town, discovering she had a talent for alterations and fine needlework. The extra income was modest but helped, and she took pride in contributing to their household. They went into town every Sunday for church and stayed for the social gatherings that followed. Grace became good friends with several of the other ranch wives, and Quinton found himself drawn into the community in ways he had not been before his marriage. He had always been well-liked, but somewhat solitary. Grace brought out a warmer, more social side of him. Winter in the Arizona Territory was mild compared to other parts of the country, but there were cold nights when the temperature dropped and frost touched the desert. On those nights, Quinton would build up the fire in their small hearth, and he and Grace would sit together, her reading aloud from whatever book they had borrowed from Mrs. Henderson while he worked on some piece of leather or wood, content in each other's company. It was on one such night in February, 5 months after their wedding, that Grace had something important to tell him. She had been feeling unwell in the mornings for the past 2 weeks, and she had missed her monthly courses. Mrs. Henderson, with her wealth of experience, had confirmed what Grace already suspected. "Quinton," Grace said, setting aside her book and moving to kneel beside his chair. "I have some news." He looked down at her, seeing the mixture of joy and nervousness in her face. "What is it?" "We are going to have a baby. I am with child." For a moment, Quinton just stared at her, processing the words. Then a smile broke across his face, transforming his usually serious expression into one of pure joy. He pulled Grace up into his lap, holding her close. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Quinton said. "Grace, you have given me everything. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Grace remained healthy and strong, continuing with her daily tasks, though Quinton increasingly insisted on doing the heavier work. He was protective to the point of being slightly overbearing, but Grace found his concern endearing rather than annoying. In late September, almost exactly a year after Quinton had proposed, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Henderson came to stay with them, along with the town doctor, a capable man named Dr. Evans, who had delivered half the babies in Old Tucson. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following afternoon, and Quinton paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal, jumping every time Grace cried out. Finally, just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the thin cry of a newborn baby filled the house. Dr. Evans emerged from the bedroom, smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Barrett, you have a son, and your wife is doing well." Quinton rushed into the bedroom to find Grace propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cotton. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Quinton approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, snuffling sounds as he rooted against Grace's chest. "He is perfect," Quinton whispered. "You are perfect." They named him Thomas Daniel Barrett, honoring Grace's first husband in a way that felt right and healing. Little Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he brought a new dimension of joy and purpose to their lives. Quinton discovered he had a talent for fatherhood, changing diapers and walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy without complaint. Grace watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him. The years rolled by, marked by the cycles of the seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with his father's blue eyes and his mother's bright spirit. When he was 2 years old, Grace found herself pregnant again, and this time the labor was shorter, resulting in a daughter they named Sarah Grace Barrett. Sarah had her mother's green eyes and a quiet, thoughtful nature that contrasted with her brother's boisterous energy. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that made water scarce and grass sparse. There were times when money was tight, and they had to make difficult decisions about where to spend their limited resources. There were illnesses and injuries, the normal trials of frontier life. But through it all, Quinton and Grace faced everything together, their love for each other and their family providing a foundation that could withstand any storm. Quinton eventually bought the land adjacent to their original 5 acres, expanding their holding and starting a small herd of cattle. It was hard work, but with Ralph Richardson's continued support and advice, the little ranch began to prosper modestly. Grace continued taking in sewing when she could find the time between caring for the children and helping with the ranch work. They made a point of going into Old Tucson at least once a month, maintaining their connections with the community that had supported them in their early days. Mrs. Henderson remained a close friend and beloved honorary grandmother to Thomas and Sarah. Ralph Richardson became godfather to both children and a frequent dinner guest at the Barrett household. Grace never saw or heard from Jeremiah Blackwell again. She learned through town gossip that he had sold the ranch within a year of her departure and moved to Texas. She felt no need for revenge or even confrontation. He had meant to destroy her, but instead, he had inadvertently set her on a path to happiness she might never have found otherwise. She had learned to forgive him, not for his sake but for her own peace of mind. There was one tense moment, about 3 years after their wedding, when Sila's kern was spotted passing through Old Tucson. Quinton had been in town that day and saw the trader's wagon rolling down the main street. Every protective instinct in him surged to the surface, and he stepped out into the street, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Silas saw him and went pale. The trader did not even slow down, just kept driving straight through town without stopping. That was the last anyone in Old Tucson ever saw of him. Word eventually filtered back that he had given up his trading routes in Arizona and moved north to New Mexico territory. Quinton liked to think their encounter had made Silas reconsider his business practices. But more likely, the man had just decided to avoid any territory where Quinton Barrett might be waiting for him. As Thomas and Sarah grew older, Grace and Quinton told them age-appropriate versions of how they had met and fallen in love. They did not hide the truth about Grace's first marriage or the difficult circumstances that had brought Quinton into her life as her rescuer. They wanted their children to understand that love sometimes came from dark places, that good could emerge from evil, and that standing up for what was right mattered. Thomas idolized his father and followed him everywhere once he was old enough to sit a horse. Quinton taught him to rope and ride, to track animals and read the weather, to handle cattle and fix fences. But he also taught him to treat people with respect, to value honesty and hard work, and to never stand by when someone needed help. Sarah was quieter but no less determined. She had her mother's gentle nature, but also a core of steel that showed itself when she stood up for what she believed was right. Grace taught her to sew and cook, to tend a garden and manage a household, but also to read and write and think for herself. Grace was determined her daughter would have choices in life, would never be at the mercy of men like Jeremiah who saw women as property. When Thomas was 8 and Sarah was 6, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, and Grace was often tired and unwell. Quinton hired a girl from town to come help with the housework and the children over Grace's protests. "You are not invincible," he told her gently but firmly. "Let people help you." In the spring of what would have been Grace's 31st year, she gave birth to twin boys, James and Joseph Barrett. The birth was difficult, and for several terrifying hours, both Grace and the babies were in danger. Dr. Evans later told Quinton privately that he had not been sure any of them would survive. But Grace, with her characteristic strength and determination, pulled through, and the twins, though small, proved to be fighters. The house that had once seemed adequately sized now bulged at the seams with 4 children. Quinton immediately began plans for an addition, and once again, the community rallied to help. Ranch hands from the Double R and neighbors from surrounding homesteads showed up on weekends to help with construction. By the end of summer, the house boasted 2 additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a capable young man who worked alongside his father on the ranch. Sarah developed a talent for teaching and began helping some of the younger children in town with their letters and numbers. The twins were a matched pair of mischief and energy, keeping everyone on their toes. Ralph Richardson retired and sold the Double R Ranch to a consortium of investors who kept Quinton on as foreman at an even better salary. Quinton was able to hire 2 permanent hands for his own growing operation, which now included over 100 head of cattle and a reputation for quality stock. Grace's hair began to show threads of silver at her temples, and Quinton's face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent his life working under the desert sun. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young cowboy and the frightened widow who had found love against all odds on a dusty Arizona trail. One evening, when Grace was 36 and Quinton was 40, they sat together on the porch of their now substantial home, watching the sunset paint familiar patterns across the sky. Thomas was 20, courting a girl from town. Sarah was 18 and had been offered a position as a schoolteacher. The twins were 13, still underfoot but growing more independent every day. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not been riding up to check on you that day?" Quinton asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. Grace leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remind myself that you did come. You did not look the other way or tell yourself it was not your business. You risked everything to save me, and you gave me a life more beautiful than I ever imagined possible." "You saved me too," Quinton said quietly. "I was just drifting before I met you, working and existing but not really living. You gave me a purpose, a family, a reason to come home every night. Everything good in my life comes from you." Grace turned her face up to kiss him, a soft, sweet kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and shared history. "We saved each other," she said, "and we built something extraordinary together." The last rays of sunlight faded, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of the twins arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes, and they could hear Sarah's patient voice mediating the dispute. These were the sounds of family, of home, of a life well lived and rich with love. Quinton pulled Grace closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat there in comfortable silence, 2 people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built the best of lives. The desert night settled around them, cool and peaceful, and they were content. Years later, when Thomas brought his own bride home and Sarah married a young rancher from a neighboring property, when the twins went off to seek their fortunes in California, before eventually returning to Arizona to settle near their parents, Grace and Quinton remained the center of their growing family. They became grandparents, watching the next generation learn to ride and rope and find their own paths in the world. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Quinton surprised Grace with a trip to San Francisco, something they had talked about for years but never quite managed. They spent a week exploring the city, marveling at the tall buildings and busy streets so different from their quiet corner of Arizona. But by the end of the week, they were both ready to go home, back to the desert and the mountains and the life they had built together. As they rode the train back across the country, Grace looked at her husband, now with silver threading through his dark hair and lines of character etched deep in his face. He was still the handsomest man she had ever known, and her heart still skipped when he smiled at her in that special way he reserved just for her. "No regrets?" Quinton asked, catching her watching him. "Not a single one," Grace said firmly. "You gave me a life worth living, Quinton Barrett. You gave me love and family and a place to belong. You gave me everything." "You did the same for me," he replied, taking her hand and kissing it just as he had done that first evening when they had admitted their love for each other. "From the moment I saw you in that wagon, I knew I would do anything to keep you safe. I just did not know then that you would become my whole world." They returned to their ranch, to their children and grandchildren, to the rhythms of the life they had created together. The seasons continued to turn, the cattle to grow, the desert to bloom after rare rains and endure through drought. And through it all, Quinton and Grace faced each day together, partners in every sense of the word. When Grace was 62 and Quinton was 66, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family. The house and barns were filled with children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. There was music and laughter, and so much love it seemed to fill the very air. That night, after everyone had gone home or settled into beds scattered throughout the house and the barn, Quinton and Grace walked out to the spot where their first house had stood, now just a foundation stones mostly hidden by grass. The new house was much larger and grander, but this spot would always be special. "You remember the night we were married, when we slept right here under the stars?" Grace asked. "I remember everything," Quinton said. "Every moment with you is etched in my memory like words carved in stone." They stood there holding hands, looking up at the vast canopy of stars overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding night and the birth of their children and every important moment of their life together. The desert was quiet around them, peaceful and eternal. "I would do it all again," Grace said softly. "Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of doubt or fear, because it all led me here to you, to this life we have built together. You are my great love, Quinton Barrett, the one who rode through the desert to save me and stayed to show me what it means to truly live." Quinton pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his heart. "And you are mine, Grace Barrett. My wife, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. Every good thing I am, every happiness I have known, every moment of peace and contentment, all of it comes from you." They kissed beneath the stars, 2 people who had found each other when all seemed lost, who had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and had built a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for generations, the story of how a cowboy had ridden through the Arizona desert to save a widow from a fate worse than death, and how that act of courage had led to a love that transformed both their lives. The stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time in their ancient, patient way. But for Quinton and Grace Barrett, time had ceased to matter. What mattered was the warmth of each other's embrace, the steady beat of hearts that had chosen to beat as one. and the absolute certainty that they had found in each other everything worth living for. They walked back to the house hand in hand, ready for whatever years remained to them, knowing that as long as they faced them together, they would be years filled with love and purpose and joy. Behind them, the desert stretched away into the darkness, vast and beautiful and unforgiving, the same desert that had once been the setting for Grace's darkest moment and Quinton's finest hour. And somewhere in the night, if you listened closely, you might have heard the echo of hoofbeats, the memory of a cowboy riding hard to reach the woman he loved before nightfall, racing against time and evil to save not just her life but his own heart. That race had ended in triumph, and the victory had lasted a lifetime, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most desperate circumstances, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm and last forever. The end of their story was also a beginning, for their descendants would carry forward the values Quinton and Grace had lived by: courage in the face of injustice, compassion for those in need, and the understanding that love is not just a feeling but a choice made every single day. The little ranch in Arizona would remain in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could build when they chose to believe in each other and refuse to let circumstances dictate their fate. And so the story of Quinton Barrett and Grace Vaughn came to its close, not with drama or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a love that had stood the test of time. They had faced their trials, overcome their obstacles, and built something beautiful and lasting. They had loved deeply, raised their family with wisdom and care, and left the world better than they found it. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for, and it was everything that mattered.